Okay. So back to what we're talking. We're going to be going through 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Maccabees here, again with apologies. With apologies to the Slav, and you did need to have 4 there. So as I said, first Maccabees is going to be sort of straightforward history. It's set in Judea, where what we've been reading, other than Esther, has been set. 2nd Maccabees is also set in Judea, and it's going to narrow in on some specific stories that take place in that same time. 3rd Maccabees takes place during the same time period, but takes place in Egypt. Okay. Now, the first thing we're going to notice is, with all these books in this time period, we're not dealing with the Persians anymore. Okay, because in the intervening time period, the Persians have gotten conquered. Okay. In the 300s, really starting around 350 BC, guy shows up who's the son of the king of Macedonia, which is just north of what we would now consider Greece. King Philip of Macedonia has a son named Alexander, and Alexander proceeds to go out and conquer the world by the time he's in his early 30s. Okay? Which is no mean feat. Right? Even at this time in history. Okay, I've mentioned the movie 300 several times when we were talking about the Persians. There's a movie about Alexander the Great that Oliver Stone made that is really bad. So
from the get-go.
It's really bad. If you're interested in history. If you're interested in bisexual romance,
go see it.
Maybe you might want to watch it. But if you're interested in history and learning about Alexander the Great, you do not really want to see it. Okay? Because it's not there. But this is to give you an idea of the time period. Okay, this is really the same time period, in addition to Alexander going out and conquering. This is really the flowering of Greek civilization. Okay? This is the period where Socrates and Plato and Aristotle lived. In fact, Aristotle was Alexander's private tutor before Alexander went out to start conquering the world. Aristotle having been Plato's pupil, where he established the Philosophical Academy in Athens. So there's this cultural flowering going on, and Alexander is going out and spreading Greek culture all over the world. And Alexander is not only going to come down and conquer the whole area around Judea and go into Egypt. That's where he's going to start. He's going to conquer what's now Turkey, come around, conquer the whole area of Syria, come down and conquer Egypt, then turn back and attack the Persian Empire, sort of in their homeland. He's going to conquer the Persian Empire. He's going to conquer all of what's now Afghanistan, all of what's now Pakistan, and attack into India. Okay. And keep in mind, they're moving troops on foot and horseback at this time in history. So you got to think about the level of territory he's spanning. Okay. In India, they're going to conquer a fair chunk of the Indian subcontinent and then ultimately get pushed back at that point. And in one of the final battles there, Alexander got injured. He retreated back to the city of Babylon in Mesopotamia, and he died there. Okay? And there's a lot of debate as to exactly how he died.
Well, the history said one of his ladies poisoned.
Well, there's theories that he was poisoned. There are also a lot of theories that he contracted a disease, that he got either typhus or he got malaria.
Or an Oliver Stone disease.
Or malaria while he was campaigning in India. He was wounded in India, so the theory is that he got some kind of infection from the wound. He also, when he was in Babylon, he's described as being depressed and sort of listless. He threw a lot of drinking parties. So there are some people who literally just think he sort of drank himself to death. that was, of course, the heroic story. The heroic story was that he drank himself to death because he was so depressed at age 31 he had no more worlds to conquer. He had nothing left to do with his life because he conquered the world. I mean, how do you follow that up, right? So there's a lot of theories. He also did have a homosexual liaison with a man in his army, and that man was killed in battle not long before he died, that they think was part of the Depression. So there were those kind of, all those kinds of circumstances. So scholars, we will probably never know exactly what killed him. But
Did they actually find his body in the Himalayas?
no, we do not know, and this is one of the interesting mysteries of the past, is that until well into the 7th century AD, people knew where his tomb was and went there as a tourist attraction to see where he was buried, and now we have no idea where it is. People are going out trying to find it all over the place. But apparently it was somewhere in Egypt that he was actually buried. Well, the city of Alexandria is named after him in Egypt. There are a number of other Alexandrias that he named after himself in various parts of Asia. And interestingly enough, his horse was named Bucephalus, and he named some cities in Afghanistan after his horse too, because he really loved his horse.
Well, in our last study of Esther, when you talked about, mentions Cleopatra. Cleopatra was not Egyptian. She
Right.
was, yes.
And we're going to get into that in just a second. Yeah,
Family,
yeah,
and which was from the family of Alexander the Great.
right. Well, sort of.
She was from Colorado.
Because he dies now young with no heir. And so there's not really an Alexander the Great empire, right? He conquers all that territory, but he never really rules it. And when they asked him as he was dying, this is another one of those famous things, they asked him when he was dying, who he would designate to inherit everything he conquered. His response was the strongest, meaning all of his generals should fight it out, and whoever wins gets it. Now the generals didn't do that. Right? The generals were a little sharper than that, and so what actually happened was the generals got together and divvied up the map. And his various generals took various parts of what Alexander the Great had conquered. So his general Lysander took what we now know as Greece, right? The Peloponnesus, he's in charge of that. Ptolemy, who was another one of his generals, took Egypt and a big chunk of North Africa. And the biggest geographical chunk was taken by a general of his named Seleucus. Seleucus was the head of what was essentially Alexander the Great's SEAL Team 6. They were called the Silver Shields. And they were sort of an elite tactical unit that Alexander the Great had, that he would send in on special assignments. And Seleucus was his general who was in charge of that unit. And so obviously he was a sharp guy, he had a lot of prestige. He took the entire area of what's now Syria, all the way from the coast of the Mediterranean, all the way to the border of India. That whole stretch east. Now, you may wonder, why did they let him have such a big piece? Well, geographically, that's the biggest piece. But in terms of big cities and civilization, especially once you get over into, I mean, you look at Afghanistan today. Okay, imagine Afghanistan in 300 BC.
About the same.
Well,
There's still
yeah.
intense
Yeah.
today.
So I mean, it wasn't, the prime territory, right? Somebody like Ptolemy would gladly trade, the wealth of Egypt for
Yeah.
a whole bunch of territory in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Right? So, and his title actually became, because he actually becomes now a king of that territory, he takes the name Seleucus the First Nicator, which means the victorious. The victorious. And we're going to see his descendants are all going to take names like this. They're going to have their proper name, a number, if there's been more than one, and then they'll give themselves some title. Okay? And these titles are going to actually become important later, but I'll show you exactly, because his son, who takes over after he dies, is named Antiochus I, and he takes the title Soter, which means Savior. Which means Savior in Greek. Okay? Now, by the time, when we get started in Maccabees, we're going to be a little ways down the dynasty. So the fellow who's going to be in charge of this territory, who's going to be the king over this territory that includes Judea at that time, is named Antiochus IV Epiphanies. And we have the holiday Epiphany coming up, which is what? When God revealed himself to us? That's what this title means, is that he's the revelation of God. So they weren't very humble. Right, in these titles. The title that Antiochus II took was actually Theos. He just took the title God for himself, okay? Now you may notice also, as an aside, pertinent especially to our church, Seleucus I, when he establishes this dynasty, his de facto capital is Babylon. Babylon was pretty run down for this point in history. So he built himself a new capital on the coast, on the Mediterranean coast, by the Orontes River, and named it after his son. And that's the city of Antioch, which is the Antioch we're going to be talking about in the New Testament, which is the Antioch that our archdiocese is named after. Okay, so that's where the city of Antioch comes from. It's built by Seleucus I. And even when we get into the Roman Empire, even though it's going to be one empire, is still going to use these same divisions, geographical divisions. So in the Roman Empire, Antioch is still going to be the capital of the East for the Romans, which is everything east that the Seleucids control.
Patriarchate of Antioch and all the East.
Right. And when the Christian church becomes legal under Constantine, the Christian church is going to use these same divisions. So the Patriarch of Antioch is the Patriarch of Antioch and all the East. Meaning everything east all the way to India. The Indian Orthodox Church is under the Patriarchate of Antioch. Okay? And then the same thing, Alexandria was the capital of Egypt under the Ptolemies. It became the capital of Africa in the Roman Empire. And the Patriarch of Alexandria is the Patriarch of Alexandria and all Africa. Okay, so these divisions are going to carry through. They exist even today in the church now. Okay. But so, we're at Antiochus IV Epiphanies. Another note on these titles, since I brought them up. When Caesar becomes Caesar, right now at this point in history, in the 100s BC, Rome is still a republic. Okay? And their territory, in the 200s, they fought a war with Carthage in North Africa, which is what kept them from getting involved with these guys very much. And so most of their territory is in what's now Italy and some of North Africa. They're a republic. But when they stop being a republic and Caesar takes over in 31 BC, starting with Julius Caesar. Caesar, as the absolute ruler of the whole empire, is going to take all of these titles for himself. It's going to be one of the things he does, is he takes all those titles. Why is that important? Because when we get to the New Testament, here in a couple years, these are titles that the New Testament expressly gives to Jesus. Savior, right here. Okay, I talked about how the second one just took the O's. Right? In the, have you ever looked at the bread stamp that we use for the bread? It has what looks like an IC and then an XC, which is an abbreviation for Jesus Christos, Jesus Christ. And then it's got an NIKA. That NIKA is Conqueror Victorious. It comes from this title. Okay? So just the way that the New Testament talks about Jesus was treason at the time they wrote it. Because they were taking these titles that Caesar had taken for himself and giving them to Jesus. Saying, no, Jesus is Lord, Caesar isn't. Jesus is the conqueror, Caesar isn't. Jesus is the Savior, Caesar isn't. Jesus is the revelation of God to us, Caesar isn't. Okay. And this is going to be very pertinent already here. I mean, we're not going to see the full flowering because obviously it's not about Jesus. But what most of the story of the books of the Maccabees is going to be this tension between Jewish people who are trying to live faithfully and who believe that Yahweh is their Savior and Yahweh is God, trying to live under these people. These kings who are claiming that they're God and that they're the ones. They're the ones to whom everyone in their territory owes allegiance. Yeah. And this isn't just going to be tension like causing people stress. This is going to be people getting killed over it. Okay, this is going to be a violent tension. They get started. So the last point is, I talked about how this flowering of Greek culture was going on at the same time that Alexander the Great was out conquering. Okay. Well, Alexander the Great was spreading Greek culture. But at the same time that he was spreading Greek culture in these other countries, he was getting influenced by the cultures of those other countries. Okay? So when Alexander the Great comes to Egypt and he conquers it, and he defeats the last pharaoh, right? Well, the Egyptians believed that Pharaoh was God. Right? We talked about that before when we've been dealing with Egypt. So the Egyptians say, well, if this guy came and defeated Pharaoh, he must be a god. Alexander's response to that is, sounds good to me. Right? I'm not going to argue with that logic. Okay, so he allows himself to begin being worshipped as a god in Egypt while he was still alive. And as he goes east, he's going to do the same thing.
What did Aristotle think about that?
Aristotle literally had to flee for his life several times later in his life because people came to try to kill him because they were so mad about what Alexander was doing. And they blamed him. So the Greeks themselves were very uncomfortable with this. Right? We have this image of the Greeks with democracy and that kind of thing. This didn't sit well with them. Okay? But this is what they ended up with. The Greeks too, the ones really over them. So this idea, as we already talked about, became widespread where the king is taking on these divine prerogatives. Okay? And the Greek culture and this religious stuff becomes intertwined. So if you, for example, aren't willing to go and worship Zeus because you worship Yahweh, that's going to be a real problem for these guys. Okay. Now, Greek culture, on the other hand, had much more advanced mathematics, much more advanced science, right? Technology, architecture. It had all these things to offer, right? Poetry, literature. So it was very attractive to a lot of the people who were conquered, including the Jews. right? That culture was very attractive. So a lot of the Jews, we're going to see probably the majority, become what's called Hellenized, which is from the Greek word. It means they get Greeked, essentially. They start to buy into the Greek culture as opposed to trying to maintain their Jewish culture. Trying to continue to follow the Jewish laws that God has given them to worship Yahweh. They start trying to adopt the Greek culture. And this goes so far as, because the Seleucids build a gymnasium in Jerusalem. Gymnasia at that time are not like how we think of them now, like a basketball court. Gymnasia, the word comes from the word for nudity in Greek. People went there and competed in athletic competition naked, and it was a celebration of the perfection of the human body.
So it was more like a movie.
It was a celebration of the perfection of the human body. Okay? And as Jews started to participate in this, if you have a naked Jewish man and a naked Greek man next to each other, there's an obvious difference. Because Jewish man is circumcised.
Greek men are not.
Jewish man is circumcised, Greek men are not. So they started using some fairly bizarre, I won't go into super detail, but going into these surgical processes to try to hide the fact that they were circumcised. To make it look like they weren't. So they would look Greek. Okay, they started not circumcising their sons. So they'd fit in with sort of the Greeks were the upper class. You know, the Greeks were the smart ones. The Greeks were the cultured ones. Everybody wanted to fit in with them. Okay. So at the same time that there's a tension between the faithful Jews and these rulers, there's also this tension within the Jewish population between those who are very happy to go along with this and who celebrate this new pagan Greek culture, and the Jews who are still trying to be faithful to their own culture. And that's all sort of brewing together here as we start. As we start First Maccabees, we're in about 180 BC. Okay? Antiochus Iv Epiphanies is the king, and this is, all these tensions are sort of gelling and about to come to a head. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here in First Maccabees. The first chapter here is sort of a real brief summary of Alexander the Great and where these people came from. Chapter 1, verse 1. After Alexander, the son of Philip the Macedonian, came out of the land of Kittim and conquered Macedonia and defeated Darius, the king of the Persians and the Medes, and reigned in his place. He was already king of Greece. He then fought numerous wars, conquered fortresses, and slaughtered the kings of the earth. Sort of a quick summary. Right? After he took over Macedon, Owen Greece, Owen conquered the Persian Empire. Then he went and had a bunch more battles. Slaughtered the kings of the earth. He went to the ends of the earth and took the spoils of many nations. So the earth rested from war before him, and he was exalted. His heart was likewise encouraged. He formed a mighty army and ruled countries, nations, and princes, and they all paid taxes to him. Then later he fell sick, and he knew he was dying. So he brought in his trusted servants who had grown up with him from childhood and parceled out his kingdom to them while he was still living. After Alexander reigned for 12 years, death claimed him. Then his servants began to rule, each in his appointed place. They all put on crowns after he died, and their sons for many years after them, and the evils they caused multiplied on the earth. So that's the quickie, right? Here's why the Persians are gone. Alexander came in and conquered, and all his buddies became kings over the various tracts of land, and they were all wicked. So verse 10, a sinful root came forth from them, Antiochus Epiphanes, the son of Antiochus the king, who was a hostage in Rome. He began his reign in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. In those days lawless men came forth from the sons of Israel, and they persuaded many, saying, let us make a covenant with the Gentiles surrounding us, for ever since we were separated from them, many evils have found us. This proposal found favor in their eyes, and some of the people eagerly desired to enter into this agreement. So they went to the king, and he gave them authority to observe the ordinances of the Gentiles. Then they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to the customs of the Gentiles, and made themselves as the uncircumcision. So they fell away from the holy covenant, yoked themselves to the Gentiles, and sold themselves to do evil. Okay, so that's Again, the summary of this huge group that goes over and decides this Greek culture is better than our tradition.
The king gave them permission.
Well, yeah, of course, Antiochus did.
Oh,
Right. So that's because remember, they're just Judea is now just a little province of this big Greek territory. Verse 16, thus the kingdom was prepared before Antiochus, and he determined he would reign over the land of Egypt, so as to rule over 2 kingdoms. Thus he entered Egypt with a strong multitude of chariots, elephants, cavalrymen, and a large army. He engaged Ptolemy, king of Egypt, in battle, and Ptolemy turned from him in shame and fled. Many were wounded and fell. So they captured mighty cities in Egypt, and Antiochus took spoils in the land of Egypt. Okay? So he goes out. Just because they're all Greeks doesn't mean they get along. Right? They've got a border, obviously. And so Antiochus went and attacked the Ptolemaic territory, the Egyptian territory, took a big chunk of it at this point. Verse 20, after he conquered Egypt in the 143rd year, Antiochus turned and went up to Israel and Jerusalem with a large army. He entered the sanctuary in arrogance and took the golden altar, the lampstand, all the utensils, the table of presentation, the cups and bowls, the golden censers, the curtain, the crowns, and the golden ornaments on the face of the temple. He stripped everything and took the silver and gold and everything costly and the hidden treasures he found. Taking all these things, he departed for his own land. He committed deeds of murder and spoke with great arrogance. There was great mourning everywhere in Israel. Rulers and elders groaned. Virgins and young men grew weak, and the beauty of the women was altered. Every bridegroom took up a lament and sat mourning in his bridal chamber. The land was shaken for its inhabitants, and all the house of Jacob was clothed with shame. Previously, Jerusalem had been near the border between the Egyptians and the Seleucids. Well, once he made inroads, Jerusalem was now pretty much his, which is why he feels like he could go back and pillage it, right? Because who are these backward Jewish people anyway? He doesn't care, right? He could care less. Verse 29, after 2 years the king sent a revenue official to the cities of Judah, and he entered Jerusalem with a large army. Antiochus spoke peaceable words to them with deceit, and they believed him. Then he fell upon the city suddenly, struck it a great blow, and killed many people from Israel. He took spoils from the city, set it on fire, and tore down its houses and the city walls. They took captive the women and the children, and took possession of the animals. Then they built the city of David with a great and strong wall and strong towers, and it became their citadel. They placed there a sinful nation of lawless men, and they became strong within it. And they laid up weapons and provisions, and gathered together the spoils they had taken from Jerusalem. Then they returned there and were like a great snare. It became an ambush against the sanctuary, an evil accuser against Israel continually. They shed innocent blood around the sanctuary and defiled the sanctuary. The inhabitants of Jerusalem fled because of them, and she became a dwelling place of strangers. She became a stranger to her offspring, and her children forsook her. Her sanctuary was laid waste like a desert, and her feasts were turned into mourning, her Sabbaths into a disgrace, and her honor into contempt. Her dishonor prevailed against her glory, and her high position was turned into mourning. So he shows up with the revenue crew, meaning his taxmen. And again, it's not like now where he said, okay, everybody, go and figure out your income, and here's the deductions, right? He said, I want X amount of money, and I want it now. Yeah. And the people of the city weren't able to come up with that amount of money right then. And so he decided to take it out of them. Which means he set his army loose, basically pillaged his own city and took everything he wanted. Okay. Now it mentions that he basically threw the Jews out and brought in other people. This is similar. We talk about the Assyrians. They did that with every place they conquered. Okay, but the Seleucids were famous for doing that with cities. And there are 2 areas. What's now Turkey was then called Asia Minor. There were 2 cities, the area around Phrygia and the area around Lydia. And we'll see those in the book of Acts 3 years or so from now when we get there. But in the time of Seleucus I, some of those Greek cities tried to rebel against him. So he did pretty much the same thing. He came in and trashed the cities, removed all the people, But in this case, he actually brought Jews from Babylon in and settled them in those cities. Okay, because there were people who were from nowhere around there. Right? So he basically punished those cities by taking the cities away from the people who lived there and giving them to somebody else. Okay, well, with Antiochus Epiphanes, this happens to the Jews in reverse. Right? They get driven out of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem gets given to this other group of Gentiles, and it gets fortified and turned into this fortress city. Okay? Which means Jews aren't going to have a lot of access to the temple now anymore, amongst other things. But that Seleucus I did, the reason it's going to come up in the book of Acts is by the time of the book of Acts, 250 years later, there's going to be large synagogues in those cities that St. Paul is going to go to visit to bring the gospel to. And those are the descendants of those Jews that Seleucus settled there. Okay, but so for now, Antiochus IV, first he came and stole everything from the temple. Now he's thrown all the Jews out of Jerusalem. Okay? Not good. We already talked about the tensions going on. Now this is the action he's taken. Verse 41, then the king wrote to all his kingdom that they all were to be as one people, so that each one was to forsake his customs. So all the nations accepted the word of the king. So the next decree goes out, right? From now on, everybody in Seleucid territory, everybody in my territory, we are all one nation, we have one culture, we have one religion, right? One set of practices. Whatever your local whatever is done. Okay? Now, we've already talked about the tensions going on in Judea. You can imagine how this is going to sit. Verse 43, many from Israel also thought it good to serve him, so they sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. So you have this big group that just goes along with it and starts worshiping the Greek gods. It gives up the Sabbath, gives up their culture. Verse 44, then the king sent books to Jerusalem and the cities of Judah by the hand of messengers, and told them to follow foreign customs in the land, to forbid whole burnt offerings and sacrifices, and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane the Sabbaths and the feasts, and to defile the sanctuary and the holy ones. Okay, we talked about, or I mentioned it briefly at one point before. The Greeks did animal sacrifices a little different. The Greeks would burn the bones of the animal. And then they would sell, for example, if it was a cow, they'd sell the leather, they'd sell the meat for people to eat. Okay. We talked before, we read in Leviticus in detail how they offered their burnt offerings. So this says they banned whole burnt offerings. This means the edict was, you're going to sacrifice the Greek way now, not the way Yahweh told you to in the law. Verse 47, these books also told them to build altars, sacred precincts, and temples to idols, to sacrifice swine and common animals, to leave their sons uncircumcised, so they would corrupt their souls by every unclean and profane thing, and forget the law and alter all the ordinances. They also added that whoever did not obey the word of the king would die. And we've just seen what he did to Jerusalem, so this isn't like an idle threat. Right? This isn't an or else. Okay? Just as directly told them they are not to obey the law of God, essentially. Verse 51, according to all these words he wrote to everyone in his kingdom. He also placed inspectors over all the people and commanded the cities of Judah to sacrifice in each and every city. Thus many of the people, everyone who forsook the law, joined together and did evil in the land. They forced Israel to hide in every place of refuge they had. Israel here means the ones who are actually obedient. Right? So they have to basically go into hiding outside the cities. Because there are inspectors, there are rats, officials from Antiochus Epiphanes, they're watching to make sure that everyone's going along with the new program. Verse 54, then on the 15th day of Chislev in the 145th year, they set up the abomination of desolation on the altar of the whole burnt offerings, and built altars in the surrounding cities of Judah. This is important. Because this reference to the Abomination of Desolation, they call it here, this is going to be referred to again in the book of Daniel. It's going to be referred to again in the book of Revelation. Okay. This is the prototypical evil act. Okay. In the mind of the scriptures, basically. When something is amazingly heinous, when something is unbelievably blasphemous, the Bible compares it to this. Okay? So Antiochus Iv Epiphanies, what this is referring to is, he went into the temple in Jerusalem, he set up a statue of Zeus in the most holy place, and he sacrificed a pig on the altar there to him. Okay? In the temple that's supposed to be. So this is, and he sacrificed it himself. Our friend, the manifestation of God. So he calls himself. Okay? So this is sort of the picture, right, for the rest of the scriptures. When we read in Daniel, when we read in Revelation, of the most blasphemous, hideous sort of thing you can do to offend God, to challenge God and His authority. Okay? And the reason they call it, why they call it an abomination is kind of obvious, right? The reason they call it the Abomination of Desolation is after something so heinous was done in the temple is now desolate, right? The temple is now wrecked in terms of functioning as a temple. It's been profaned. Yeah. And not only do they do that in the temple, but they set up altars all over Judea where they're offering pagan sacrifices. Verse 55, they also burned incense at the doors of houses and in the streets. And when they found books of the law, they tore them to pieces and burned them in the fire. Whenever a book of the covenant was found in someone's possession, or if anyone sympathized with the law, the judgment of the king was to kill him. They acted with their might against Israel, against those who were found month after month in the cities. Then on the 25th day of the month they sacrificed on the altar, which was on top of the altar of the whole burnt offerings. In keeping with the decree, they sentenced to death the women who had their children circumcised, and the families who had circumcised them, and hung the infants from their mothers' necks. Yet many in Israel grew strong and determined in themselves not to eat unclean things. They chose rather to die than be defiled by foods or profane the holy covenant. So they died, and great wrath came upon Israel. There's a pretty hideous example of what they were doing. But no, there's still this remnant. There's still this remnant here that decides, and this is very important because this is the beginning. When we get into the New Testament, and obviously in church history after the New Testament, we're going to talk about martyrs. And we just celebrated this last week, St. Stephen's Day, the first martyr. Okay? This is where that really begins. That idea that people who believe and want to follow God have to decide, as these people did, that they would rather die than sin. Yeah. Now, if I'm honest, I can't say I've really made that choice because I've done a lot of sinning. Right? And nobody's been threatening me with death to get me to do it either. Right? It's been a whole lot easier than that. Nobody's had to put a gun to my head to get me to do the wrong thing. Okay? But these people have decided they're going to do the right thing with a gun to their head. Right? And seeing, not just this is a theoretical, but seeing people dying around them. These women having their dead children hung around their necks for disobeying. Okay. So here, one of the reasons why, and we're going to see this throughout the books of the Maccabees, one of the reasons why these books are so important is the beginning of that idea. The beginning of that understanding. That commitment to God, eventually commitment to Christ. As Christ says, take up your cross and follow me. It means a commitment to be willing to die. We've done a couple chrismations in the last couple of weeks. And there's a line in the old, we've been using the old chrismation service, and there's a line in the chrismation service where you pray that, the old one, where you pray that the person who's being chrismated will be willing someday to joyfully go to their death for Christ. At the time that old service was written, that was happening in Russia every day. People were having to make the same choice. So this isn't something that's distant from us. You know, we've been very blessed to live in this country where for the most part we don't have a gun put to our head and be told to deny Christ or die. Right? But that's happening right now in a lot of places in the world. And it's not beyond possibility that it could happen to us in our lifetime. We can't take that for granted. But this is true even if we're not literally put in that situation. The monastic fathers of the church tell us that the point we have to get to is just this point where we would rather die than sin. We would rather die than offend God. We would rather die than offend Christ because of how much we love Him and how much He loves us. That's the point we need to seek to arrive at. That's how we need to look at our behavior in our hearts. Okay. So now we know there's this group that's resisting. Now we're going to talk about a particular family here, starting in chapter 2. 2 verse 1. In those days, Mattathias, the son of John of the tribe of Simeon, a priest of the sons of Joarib, rose up from Jerusalem and settled in Modin. Now remember, probably don't remember, because it was a footnote back in First Ezra. But way back in First Ezra, we talked about how, remember, the northern kingdom was wiped, and all those tribes were wiped out. Right? And who came back from the exile was the tribe of Judah, tribe of Benjamin, and some Levites, right, who had been working in the temple, who had been from the southern kingdom. But remember, there was a little note in First Ezra that there were two groups of people who actually weren't ethnically Jewish, but who had helped the people during the exile, who had helped the Jewish people. And they were to be reckoned as being from the tribe of Simeon. Remember that? If you don't, the Bible study's on the internet. You can listen to it again. But we made note of that. There were these two groups that were to be considered to be part of the tribe of Simeon, even though technically they weren't descended from Simeon, because they worshipped Yahweh. Right? And that was another example of how the religion wasn't really ethnic, right? If you started to follow Yahweh, you became a Jew and you became part of it. Well, so this family now that we're going to read about, which is going to include Judas Maccabeus, who this whole thing's named after, is one of these quote-unquote Simeonites. Technically speaking, not Jewish. Technically speaking, not ethnically Jewish. Okay? So this is another interesting note in terms of who it is who God chooses in these situations. So Mattathias, verse 2, he has 5 sons. John called Gotti. This is not that John Gotti. Simon called Thasi. Judas called Maccabeus. Eleazar called Avaran. And Jonathan called Apphus. He saw the blasphemies taking place in Judah and Jerusalem, and said, Alas, why was I born to see this, the ruin of my people, the destruction of the holy city, and to live there when it was delivered into the hand of the enemy, the sanctuary into the hand of foreigners. Her temple has become like a man without honor. Her glorious vessels were carried away into captivity. Her infants have been slain in the streets, her young men with the sword of the enemy. What nation has not inherited her palaces and taken hold of her spoils? All her adornment has been removed. In place of freedom she has become a slave. And behold, our sanctuary, our beauty and our glory have been laid waste. And the Gentiles have desecrated it. Why should we live any longer? Thus Mattathias and his sons tore their clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned exceedingly. Okay, so that's, poetically, he says, I wish I had never been born to have to see this. Verse 15. Now those from the king who were enforcing the apostasy journeyed to the city of Modin to make them offer sacrifice. And many from Israel also came with them. So Mattathias and his sons gathered together. Then those from the king spoke to Mattathias, saying, You are a great and glorious leader in this city, and supported by your sons and brothers. Now come, be the first to follow the decree of the king, as all the Gentiles and the men of Judah have done, and those who remain in Jerusalem. And you and your sons will be among the king's friends, and you and your sons will be honored with silver and gold and many rewards. So they come to him because we talked about how in the Jewish cities it was the older men, it was the elders of the city who sort of ran things. So he's one of the older men, he's got all these sons, he's got brothers. They come to him as an influential man in the city. They say, hey, we're here to enforce the king's edict. Why don't you come and sacrifice to the new gods, and then you'll be one of the king's friends. He'll be grateful, right? And he'll give you wealth, and everything will be wonderful. So not only do you, we won't even bring up the whole "you'll die if you don't" thing. But look at all we have to offer if you just go along with the program. Verse 19, then Mattathias answered, speaking with a loud voice, though all the Gentiles in the house of the kingdom of the king obey him, and each turns from the worship of their fathers and chooses to follow his commands, my sons and my brothers and I will continue in the covenant of our fathers. Far be it from us to forsake the law and the ordinances. We will not obey the words of the king to turn aside from our worship to the right or to the left. When he finished saying these words, a Jew came forward in the sight of everyone to sacrifice upon the altar in Modin, in accordance with the king's decree. When Mattathias saw him, he was filled with zeal, and his heart trembled and poured forth anger and judgment. Then he ran and slew him upon the altar. So he killed the king's man who wanted to offer sacrifice at that time, and he tore down the altar. Thus he had zeal for the law, just as Phinehas had against Zombri the son of Salome. You remember Phinehas back in Numbers. Remember when their judgment was against them for having slept around with the Canaanite women?
Yeah.
And while they're there mourning and asking God for forgiveness, our friend Zombri came sauntering through with a Canaanite woman to go into his tent. And so Phinehas came over with a spear and took care of both of them. Well, Mattathias, while he's standing there making this pronouncement that even though they kill him, he's not going to sacrifice, some other guy comes walking, okay, I'll sacrifice. Right? And so Mattathias snaps and kills him and kills the messenger from the king. Right? As you might imagine, this is not going to go over well with the king. Verse 27, then Mattathias cried out with a loud voice in the city, saying, everyone who has zeal for the law and holds to the covenant, let him follow me. So he and his sons fled into the mountains and left behind whatever they had in the city. Then many who sought righteousness and judgment went down to the desert to live there, they, their sons, their women, and their cattle, because evils increased severely against them. It was also announced to the king's men and the soldiers in Jerusalem, the city of David, that certain men who had scattered when the command of the king was made known had gone into hiding in the desert. Thus many ran after them, tracked them down, marched against them, and engaged them in battle on the Sabbath day. So they now know they're going to be in trouble. So they head out into the wilderness. They head out of the cities. Other people who are like-minded gather around them. Okay. Now this is important because we're going to see this again in the New Testament. When the Romans have taken over Judea, right? In the New Testament, in the Gospels, the Romans are in charge. Okay? The people who are high priests at that time are people who have compromised with the Romans. They've been appointed by the Romans. The temple at that time was built by Herod, who wasn't Jewish. Okay. So the Jews who are really serious, a large number of them who are really serious about following God's law, are going to start going out into the desert. One of those groups is the Essenes, who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay. Another one of those groups is started by St. John the Forerunner. St. John the Baptist, where was he? He was out in the wilderness. And they were going out and following him. Okay? They're going out into the wilderness. Okay? Now, the difference is here they're forming an army. Right? In Maccabees, essentially. They're forming an army. Okay? But this is why when we get into the New Testament, the people, when they think about the Messiah, what are they thinking about? They're thinking about somebody who's going to come and raise an army and overthrow the Romans. Okay? in a real literal sense. Okay? So, remember there's that point in the Gospels where right before St. John the Baptist dies, he sends a messenger. He sends a messenger to Jesus asking if he's the Messiah or if there's someone else coming. Because even he didn't fully understand. Because they're taking this real literally and saying, well, St. John, he must be forming if he's not the Messiah, he must be forming the army out there in the wilderness for the Messiah, and the Messiah is going to come and take that army and go overthrow the Romans. Right? So even St. John Porter doesn't get it. So how does Jesus answer the messenger? He says, what are the things you've seen? Right? The blind see, the lame walk. Right? He points to all the things when we get into the prophets, all the things that were supposed to happen when the Messiah comes. Right? So what he says is, yes, I'm the Messiah, and you're not thinking about the Messiah the right way. The enemy you think I'm here to defeat isn't the one I'm really here to defeat. It's not just the Romans that are the problem. But we get a picture here. We get a picture here of what's going to come. So, word gets out that there are these groups that are hiding out in the desert that are outlaws, from the king's laws at least. And so they send men out. The king sends men down after them. Okay, and there's a battle.
Fight them on the Sabbath, which is kind of a problem.
Verse 33, then they said to them, now come out and do the will of the king, and you shall live. Right, that's their beginning negotiating point. Right? Come out of the desert and come back and do what the king says, and you won't be killed by us. Negotiating point 1. But they answered, we will not come out, nor will we do the will of the king to desecrate the Sabbath day. So the enemy rushed into battle against them. Yet they did not answer them, nor did they cast a stone, nor did they block up their hiding places, saying, let us all die in our innocence. Heaven and earth will testify for us that you destroyed us unjustly. So the king's men rose against them in battle on the Sabbath, and they died along with their women, children, and cattle, as many as 1,000 people. Okay? So they say, it's the Sabbath day, better for us to die innocent than fight back. Okay? Do you remember what I was saying about martyrdom? This is the beginning about that. And remember, why do they say heaven and earth will testify? In the law, in Deuteronomy, you need 2 witnesses. And you go to a court to establish something. So it's saying heaven and earth will see us here that you slaughtered us and we did nothing. And so on the day of judgment, when the time comes to answer for what happened, they'll have their witnesses that they are innocent. So 1,000 people die. Verse 39, then Mattathias and his friends grieved for them exceedingly. So each one said to his neighbor, if we do as our brothers did and fail to fight against the Gentiles for our life and our ordinances, they will quickly wipe us off the earth. So they resolved on that day, saying, every man who comes against us for battle on the Sabbath day, let us war against him, and we shall not all die as our brothers did in their hiding places. Then the synagogue of the Hasidians gathered with them, a mighty army from Israel, everyone who willingly offered himself for the law. Synagogue here doesn't literally mean a synagogue, the way we're thinking. Synagogue just is a Greek word for the gathering together. Okay, so this big group gathering together, they've now got enough people for an army who are loyal.
Is Hasidians, or is that the Hasidic?
Right, yes. It's not the same thing as Hasidic Jews, but it comes from the same root. The Hebrew word chassid means faithful. Okay? So this is the idea is that the gathering together of the faithful Jews, the ones who are faithful to the Torah, is all with them. And so they have this army. Verse 43, everyone who escaped from evils was added to them and became their support. So they formed an army and struck the sinners in their wrath and the lawless men in their anger. The rest fled to the Gentiles to be rescued. Mattathias and his allies also surrounded the altars and tore them down, and they circumcised the uncircumcised boys by force, as many as they found in the mountains of Israel. Thus they pursued the sons of arrogance, and the undertaking prospered in their hand. They took the law out of the hand of the Gentiles and the kings, and did not allow the sinners to dominate them. So, they now are pushing back, and they're deliberately doing the exact opposite of the king's orders. They're destroying all of the pagan worship sites. When they find Jewish boys who aren't circumcised, they're taking care of it. Right? Verse 49, Then the days approached for Mattathias to die, and he spoke to his sons, saying, Now arrogance and scorn in the time of destruction and furious anger have been strengthened. Therefore, children, be zealous for the law, and offer your lives for the covenant of our fathers. And remember the deeds our fathers did in their generations, and received great honor and an everlasting name. Was not Abraham found faithful in trial, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness? And Joseph at the time of his trouble kept the commandment, and became ruler of Egypt. Phinehas our father showed true zeal, and received a covenant of eternal priesthood. Joshua fulfilled the word, and became a judge in Israel. Caleb testified in the assembly, and received an inheritance in the land. David, in the mercy shown him, inherited the throne of the kingdom forever. In his great zeal for the law, Elijah was taken up into heaven. Ananias, Azarias, and Mishael believed and were saved from the fiery furnace. We'll read about that when we get to the book of Daniel. In his innocence, Daniel was delivered from the mouth of lions. Again, book of Daniel. Thus understand from generation to generation that all who hope in the Lord will not be weak. Do not fear the words of a sinful man, because his glory is like manure and worms. Today he will be exalted, but tomorrow he will not be found. For he returned to his dust, and his purpose will perish. Children, be courageous and strong in the law, because you will be honored by it. So, for the perspective, what they're saying is, for the perspective of God, our friend Antiochus is manure and worms. Because what's going to be left of him 50 years from now? 100 years from now? Manure and worms. Verse 65, So behold, Simeon, your brother, I know he is a man of wisdom. Listen to him every day, and he shall be your father. Judas Maccabeus, mighty in fighting from his youth, he shall be the leader of your army, and he will fight the fight of the people. And you bring forth with you all those who are doers of the law, and seek justice for your people. Repay the Gentiles in full, and hold fast to the ordinance of the law. Then he blessed them, and was added to his fathers. So he died in the 146th year, and was buried in the tomb of his fathers in Modin. And all of Israel mourned him with great mourning. Okay, so he hands down, he gives Simeon, the oldest brother, is in charge of his possessions of the family. Judah the Hammer, who got his nickname for being good in battle, he's in charge of the military operations. Chapter 3, Then Judas his son, who is called Maccabees, rose up in his place. His brothers all helped him, and everyone who had been allied with his father. They fought the battle for Israel with gladness. And there's here it's called the Eulogy to Mattathias in the Orthodox Study Bible. He enlarged his people's glory, and was clothed with a breastplate like a giant. And he girded on his weapons and waged war. Sheltering the camp with his sword, he was like a lion in his deeds, like a young lion roaring for its prey. For he pursued the lawless and searched them out, and he set on fire those who troubled his people. The lawless were humbled from fear of him, and all the workers of lawlessness were troubled. For deliverance prospered by his hand. He embittered many rulers, and brought joy to Jacob by his deeds. May his memory be blessed forever. He passed through the cities of Judah, and destroyed the ungodly from the land. And he turned wrath away from Israel. His name was known to the ends of the earth, and he gathered those who were perishing.
He was embittered. Is this a reference indirectly when it speaks of being embittered on Easter service?
It's the same word.
In any way, does it mean the same thing?
Well, it's
being embittered.
It's the same word, so it's the same idea.
He embittered many rulers.
Yeah, right.
Is that also there?
No, just the word embittered is the same. Is the same word. Verse 10, Then Apollonius gathered the Gentiles together, and brought a great army from Samaria to wage war with Israel. But Judas knew it, and went out to meet him. He struck and killed him, and many wounded fell, and the rest fled. They took their spoils, and Judas took the sword of Apollonius, and fought with it every day. Now Saron, the leader of the army of Syria, heard Judas had gathered a large assembly of faithful men with him. and they were going out into battle. So he said, I will make a name for myself and be honored in the kingdom. I will fight Judas and his followers who despise the word of the king. He set forth, and with him went an army of godless men, strong enough to help him take vengeance on the sons of Israel. So if you look at the first map on the new map paper, I know you can't really read the city names inside the area, but that area, that dark area, is Judea proper. Okay? So word of this rebellion starts getting out to the neighbors. Okay, so first, a Greek army forms up at Samaria, and they go after Judah the hammer and get hammered. They get defeated. And so then up here in Syria, and one of the leaders in Syria says, hey, these guys are causing a lot of trouble for the king. If I go and take care of them for the king, right, he'll reward me. Great, I'll make a name for myself. I can move up here in the ranks. Verse 16, so he drew near to the highlands of Beth-horon, and Judas went out to meet him with only a few allies. As they saw the army coming to meet them, they said to Judas, how long will we, being few, be able to fight against such a powerful number? We who have come out today are weak from lack of food. Then Judas said, it is easy to hem in many at the hands of a few, and it makes no difference before heaven to save with many or with few. For victory in battle does not come from the size of the army, but from the might of heaven. These come against us in the abundance of insolence and lawlessness, to seize us and our women and to take spoils from us. But we are fighting for our lives and our laws. God himself will crush them from before our face, but as for you, do not fear because of them. When he was through speaking, Judas suddenly rushed against them, and Saron and his army were destroyed before him. He pursued him into the descent of Beth-horon as far as the plain. Around 800 of their soldiers perished. The remainder fled into the land of the Philistines. Then fear of Judas and his brothers began, and terror fell upon the nations around them. So his fame reached the king, and the Gentiles talked about the battles of Judas. So there's good news and there's bad news. Good news is, even with their tiny force, they managed to beat back this giant Syrian army. Right, that's the good news. Bad news is, that was a big enough victory that now our friend the king has become aware of this revolt in little backwater Judea. And you can see here in that first map the relative size. Right? Much smaller than it's ever been. Right? This tiny little piece of land. But now the king's aware that there's a problem. Verse 27, when Antiochus the king heard these words, he was very angry. And he sent and gathered all the forces of his kingdom, an exceedingly strong army. He also opened his treasury and gave a year's wages to the troops and commanded them to be ready for any need. Okay. So he gives them a year's worth of pay in advance. And says, you guys are all now on call. Right? When I need you, just be ready to move. And then he noticed the silver in the treasury was depleted, and the taxes from the region were small, because of the dissension and misfortune he caused in the land when he took away the laws that existed from the earliest days. So he took care not to pay out expenditures and give gifts as abundantly as he had done before, even more lavishly than the previous kings. He was very disturbed in himself, so he decided to go to Persia and collect taxes from those regions and gather abundant silver. So taxes are down.
Gotta go get some.
So he goes over to Persia, where they're a little more docile right at the moment, and makes up the difference. He left Lysias, a man of distinction from the royal lineage, in charge of all the king's affairs, from the river Euphrates to the boundary of Egypt. He was also to take care of his son Antiochus until his return. Then he handed over to Lysias half of the armies and the elephants. He gave him orders concerning all his wishes and concerning those who lived in Judea and Jerusalem. Remember how far his kingdom stretches. Okay, so he's got elephants, war elephants, to go with his troops. It's hard to imagine for us because we've seen elephants at zoos and circuses and stuff. Okay, but imagine if you'd never seen an elephant, and the first time you saw it was when you had about 12 of them charging straight at you. Right? You can kind of imagine their effectiveness in warfare just comes from that in terms of striking terror. Like, what is that creature running at me, right? Okay. So verse 35, he ordered him to send an army against them to destroy them and remove the might of Israel and the remnant of Jerusalem, and to remove their memory from that place. He was also to settle foreigners in all their regions and distribute their land by lot. Okay, so he's not just planning to go there and put down the rebellion. He's planning to go there, wipe them out, wipe out their memory, confiscate their possessions, move people from other places into their houses, like we talked about before, give away their land to other people by casting lots. They're going to be gone. He's intending to destroy them utterly. Then the king took half of the remaining armies and left Antioch, the capital of his kingdom. In the 147th year he crossed over the Euphrates River and entered the regions on the other side. Lysias appointed Ptolemy the son of Dorymenes and Nicanor and Gorgias, valiant men who were loyal to the king. And he sent with them 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry to go into the region of Judah and crush it according to the king's orders. So he set out with the whole army, and they went and camped near Emmaus on the plain. When the merchants of the region heard about them, they took a very large amount of silver and gold and shackles and went into the camp to obtain the sons of Israel as slaves. The army of Syria and of the land of the Philistines joined them as well. Okay, so they roll up the king's whole army. Okay, why do you think the leftovers of the Syrian army and the area of Lycia joined too? They're looking for pillage, right, after they win. So they start joining in too, and they're already bringing chains with them because they're planning to get themselves some slaves that they can go and sell. They can go and sell to make some more money. I'm going to return to this in a minute after the battle, but notice the place where this big battle is taking place. This village called Emmaus, which has not been mentioned in the Bible before, is going to be mentioned in the Bible later, but I'll come back to it. Verse 42, now Judas and his brothers saw that evil events were increasing and the armies were encamped at their borders. They learned also the words of the king which he ordered to bring destruction and annihilation on the people. So each man said to his neighbor, let us repair the ruin of our people and battle for our people in the sanctuary. Then the assembly gathered to prepare for battle and to pray and ask God for mercy and compassion. Jerusalem was uninhabited like a desert. No one brought products in or took them out, and the sanctuary had been trampled down. The sons of foreigners were in the citadel, a lodging place for the Gentiles. Gladness was taken from Jacob, and flute and harp played no more. They assembled and went into Mizpah, opposite Jerusalem, because at a former time Mizpah was a place of prayer in Israel. Right? They can't go into the temple. The temple's been desecrated. They fasted on that day and put on sackcloth, sprinkled ashes upon their head, and tore their garments. They opened the book of the law and took to look into those matters about which the Gentiles consulted the likenesses of their idols. They also carried the priestly garments and the first fruits of the tithe, and they stirred up the Nazarites who had finished their days. Then they cried aloud to heaven, saying, what do we do with these, and where will we take them? Your sanctuary has been trampled down and defiled, and your priests are in mourning and humiliated. Behold, the Gentiles have gathered against us to destroy us. You know what they plan against us. How will we be able to stand against them if you will not help us? Then they blew the trumpets and cried out with a loud shout. After this, Judas appointed rulers for the people, leaders for thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens. He ordered those who were building houses or were betrothed to women or were growing vineyards or were afraid to return each one to his own home according to the law. Even in this completely desperate situation, right? They look at the book of the law and it says, you don't draft anybody who just got married. You don't draft anybody right before the harvest. You don't force someone to fight who just doesn't want to fight, who's just scared. Right? They're in this completely desperate situation, but he's still
obeying the law.
He's still sending them home. Then the army departed and set up camp south of Emmaus. Judas said to them, be ready at dawn to fight with these Gentiles who have gathered against us to destroy us in our sanctuary. For it is better for us to die in war than to look upon the evils of the evils the Gentiles would bring to us in the sanctuary. But as God's will is in heaven, so he will do. Okay? So they go there, they gather to fight, but it's interesting what he says. It's interesting what he says. He doesn't say, well, we've been faithful, so God's going to make sure we win. Right? He doesn't say that. Because they haven't been, especially if you take the nation as a whole, they haven't been faithful at all. Right? They frankly deserve to get invaded and wiped out. What he says is, even if we die here, right, God's going to do as God wills in terms of the outcome of this battle. But it's better to die here than to see what's been going on in Judea. To see how they've desecrated the temple, to see all these evils that they're doing. Better off dying in battle. So chapter 4, verse 1, Then Gorgias took 5,000 men and 1,000 choice cavalry, and the army marched out by night, to descend upon the camp of the Judeans and strike them suddenly. Young men from the citadel served as his guides. But Judas got word of it, and he and his soldiers marched out to strike the king's army in Emmaus, while his forces were dispersed from the camp. When Gorgias came into the camp of Judas at night, he found no one. So he sought them in the mountains, saying that these are fleeing from us. So what happens is, the king's men have a bunch of people from Jerusalem that they're using as essentially spies. And they find out where Judas's camp is. So they circle around to come attack his camp. Judas hears they're circling around to come attack the camp, so he goes and counterattacks. So when the group coming to the camp arrives at the camp, the army's already gone. Well, they assume, right, we know what kind of guy our friend the king is. They assume, they must have run away from us. Right? So rather than going and rejoining the rest of the army that Judas is attacking, they go out into the mountains looking for fleeing Jewish troops that aren't there. Okay. Verse 6, At first light, Judas was seen on the plain with 3,000 men, but they did not have armor and swords as they wished. They saw the Gentiles' camp with strong fortification and surrounded by cavalry trained for battle. But Judas said to his men, Do not be afraid of their numbers or of their attack. Remember how our fathers were saved in the Red Sea when Pharaoh pursued them with his army? So now let us cry out to heaven and see if the Lord will be with us. And remember the covenant of our fathers and crush these forces before us this day. Then all the nations will know that he is the Redeemer and Savior of Israel. Okay, so the light dawns, and now they can kind of see what they're up against. Right? That doesn't mean they had no armor and swords. It means they didn't have as many as they wanted. Right? Because who are these guys? These guys are basically just refugees. Guerrilla fighters who wanted to obey the law. They don't have a lot of equipment. Right? They don't have a lot of anything. And they're up against this professional giant army. And again, Judas rallies them by saying, look, God wants us to defeat them, we can still win. So they charge.
The word Redeemer and Savior.
Right. And
is Redeemer one of the names of the king?
No, but Savior is one of the titles they took. But again, he says this way, if we win, we'll win because God wants to show everyone who he is. Right? He's not saying, we've been such good boys and girls that God will have to let us win. So the Gentiles lifted their eyes and saw them coming opposite them. And they departed from their camp and went into battle. Then those with Judas sounded the trumpets. Thus they met, and the foreigners were crushed, fleeing into the plain. All those remaining fell by the sword. They pursued them as far as Gazara, and as far as the plain of Idumea and Azotus and Jamnia. About 3,000 of their men fell. Then Judas and his army returned from pursuing them, and he said to the people, Do not desire the spoils, for the battle is before us. Gorgias and his army are in the mountains nearby. But stand firm before our enemies and battle them, and afterwards take the spoils boldly. Okay, so he hits the main body of their army, and miraculously not only defeats them, but remember, he had 3,000 men. They killed 3,000 of the enemy. And he's still got an army. Okay, so that's a rout. Right? So he routs them. Then he says, don't start picking through what they left yet. We've still got that group with the other general back here. Okay, so they form up again. While Judas was finishing these words, an enemy detachment was seen peeping out from the mountains. So they spot the advanced scouts from Gorgias' army, who are probably somewhat surprised to see
They're hiding behind the rocks.
Just peeping out.
the rest of their army gone, right? Verse 20, and they saw that their army had been put to flight and that the Judeans had set their camp on fire, for the smoke that was seen revealed what had happened. When they became aware of this, they were very afraid, and when they observed the forces of Judas prepared for battle in the plain, they fled to the region of the Philistines. Judas returned to take spoils from their camp, and they took massive amounts of gold and silver, and cloth dyed blue and purple, and abundant wealth. As they returned from battle, they sang hymns and blessed heaven, because the Lord is good, for his mercy endures forever. Thus great deliverance happened to Israel on that day. But all the Gentiles who escaped went and reported to Lysias everything that had happened. When he heard this, he was bewildered and disheartened, because things had not happened to Israel as he wished, and had not turned out as the king had commanded him. Right? Because the king had commanded him to go and take it. Well, now he's kind of stuck in the middle, because his army just failed to do that. Who do you think the king is going to hold responsible for
God's going
said army's failure?
But he's more bewildered than frightened. It's like, how come?
What? How exactly did this happen? Yeah. Verse 28, the following year Lysias recruited 60,000 chosen men and 50,000 cavalry so he could fight them. Then he came to Idumea and camped in Beth-zur, and Judas met them there with 10,000 soldiers. So Judas has rounded up more people. Right? As they've been victorious, he's starting to win over more of the Judean people.
And he has more silver and gold.
Well, but also, I mean, this is, the point is, it's not, he was, circumcising people by force, we're told. But he is calling the people back to the line. More and more of them are starting to come over to the right side. So now he's up to 10,000, but he's got, 110,000 people coming up against him. When he saw their mighty camp, he prayed and said, "Blessed are you, O Savior of Israel, who stopped the attack of the giant warrior by the hand of your servant David, and delivered the Philistines' camp into the hands of Jonathan the son of Saul, his armor-bearer. Even so, besiege this camp by the hand of your people Israel, and let these enemies be ashamed of their army and cavalry. Put cowardice in them and melt the boldness of their might, and let them be shaken by their defeat. Cast them down with the sword of those who love you, and let all men who know your name give praise to you with hymns." Then they attacked one another, and 5,000 men from the camp of Lysias fell, and some fell from the opposite side. When Lysias saw the turn of events for his troops, and the courage shown by those of Judas, and how they were prepared either to live or to die bravely, he returned to Antioch and recruited mercenaries to again invade Judea with an even greater force.
He's not got.
So he makes a strategic retreat and hires some more people. So now I'm going to pause a second and mention, anybody off the top of their head where the other place in the Bible?
On the road to Emmaus. Saul of Tarsus.
in the he was on the road to Damascus. But close. Road to Emmaus is in the Gospel of Luke. It's at the end of the Gospel of Luke.
We may meet Christ on the road.
They meet Christ on the road. Remember, at the end of Gospel of Luke, Cleopas, right, and another disciple of Jesus, who traditionally is Luke himself, and that Luke didn't insert his own name, right, were walking on the road to Emmaus, to this village. Okay, they're walking on the road to Emmaus, and Jesus, after having risen from the dead, appears to them, and they don't recognize him. They don't recognize him. And Jesus says to them, when he appears to them, because they're talking, he says, "What is it that you're talking about while you're walking on this road? You seem very sad." Right? And so they tell him about what happened to Jesus, and ended by saying, "We had thought he was going to be the one to deliver Israel. We thought he was going to be the Messiah." Implied, but I guess we were wrong because he's dead. Right? And then Jesus goes through the scriptures, meaning what we would call the Old Testament, and explains to them who the Messiah was really going to be. Right? And it's then when they get to their destination for the night, and they're sitting there eating, Jesus takes the bread and breaks it, and they recognize him. They recognize him now. It's significant that there's only two places in the Bible Emmaus is mentioned. Here and this battle. This big climactic battle, right, that wins little Judea here her freedom, right? Makes her an independent country. We thought he was going to be the one to deliver Israel. What do they mean when they say that?
A military.
They're on the road to Emmaus. We thought he was going to be like Judas Maccabees.
Yeah.
We thought he was going to come and deliver Israel from the Romans. Right? He was going to make us free and independent again. Right? Well, how does Jesus answer that? He takes them through the scriptures and says, you're not interpreting it right. You're not understanding. You're not understanding. Okay. And then when they finally recognize him, when is it?
When he breaks the bread.
Right, which is what we do every Sunday. Every Sunday. All right? What is St. Paul, when St. Paul has to talk to the Corinthians about the way they're celebrating communion, right? He gives a warning about those who receive communion without perceiving the body and blood of Christ, without recognizing Christ, without recognizing who he is. Right? Not just what it is, but who he is. Okay? So this is connected. This is connected. The people, most of the Jews to whom Christ came were figuratively on the road to Emmaus. Right? One of his 12 disciples was Simon the Zealot. Right? The Zealot meaning like Phineas, meaning he was part of one of these militant groups, right, that was out trying to overthrow the Romans. Okay? They were thinking, this is what the Messiah is going to do. Right? And Jesus doesn't say that's wrong so much as he says, this is a picture, but it's a picture. There's a real enemy. Right? The Romans or the Greeks or the Persians or the Babylonians aren't the real enemy. Right? The real enemy is death that brings sin, right? That's wielded by the devil. Those are the enemies. And so Christ explains that, yes, he came as the Messiah to defeat the enemies of people, to free them, to set them free, but it's to set us free from death, to set us free from sin, to set us free from the power of the devil. Not who cares about the Romans? The Romans are what? Manure and worms, right? We just read, right? The Romans are manure and worms. The Soviets are now manure and worms, right? They all think at the time they're alive that they can challenge God and destroy Christ and destroy the Christian people, and it never works out for them. Right? But it's the real enemies. It's the real enemies. And that's why that little bit that Luke drops in there, this reference to this village of this battle is so important. Is that the people who were reading it needed to reconfigure their view of who the Messiah was. Jesus was the one who came to deliver Israel. To really deliver Israel. And now, as we look at the rest of this chapter, remember that as soon as St. Luke is done with this story, the way the Gospel of Luke ends is that after they recognize Christ and he disappears, we're told that the people were every day in the temple rejoicing. Okay, that's how the Gospel of Luke ends. Where do we go right after the battle? In the book of Maccabees. Verse 36, so Judas and his brothers with him said, behold, our foes have been crushed. Let us go up to purify the sanctuary and renew it. As soon as the Battle of Emmaus is over, they go to the temple to renew it, right? To bring true worship back to it. What's been going on there hasn't been true worship of God, very blatantly. Verse 37, thus the entire camp gathered and ascended to Mount Zion. They saw there the sanctuary deserted, the altar desecrated, the doors burned down. In the courtyard they found that bushes had grown up as in a wooded area or on one of the mountains. They also saw the priests' quarters in ruins, so they tore their garments and lamented greatly and sprinkled themselves with ashes. They fell on their faces on the earth, sounded the signal on the trumpets, and cried to heaven. So they find it, and not only has it been used for pagan worship, but they haven't even taken care of it. Right? So between the stones and the walkways, there's plants growing out. Verse 41, then Judas ordered his men to fight those in the citadel until he purified the sanctuary. He chose righteous priests devoted to the law. They purified the sanctuary and carried the defiled stones to an unclean place. So they go so far as to take all the stones that had touched the pagan sacrifices, they take out and throw away in an unclean place and replace them.
So they basically just clean out the building and the whole hill.
Right, they're cleaning it out, cleansing the whole thing. And they discussed what they should do with the altar of whole burnt offerings which had been desecrated. It seemed to them the best plan was to tear it down so it would not be a reproach to them because the Gentiles had corrupted it. So they tore down the altar. They also stacked the stones in an appropriate location on the temple hill until a prophet would come and tell them what should be done with them. Then they took uncut stones according to the law and constructed a new altar like the one before. They also repaired the sanctuary and the inside of the temple and consecrated the courtyards. They made new holy vessels and carried the lampstand, the altar of incense, and the table into the temple. And they burnt incense on the altar and lit the lights on the lampstands. And these gave light inside the temple. Then they set bread on the table, hung the curtains, and completed all the tasks they had begun. Verse 52, they rose early on the morning of the 25th day of the 9th month, which is the month of Chislev, in the 148th year, and offered sacrifice according to the law on the new altar of whole burnt offerings which they made. It was consecrated with songs and harps and lutes and cymbals at the time and on the day the Gentiles had desecrated it. All the people fell down and worshipped and blessed heaven which had prospered them. They celebrated the consecration of the altar for 8 days. They offered whole burnt offerings with gladness, and the sacrifice of a peace offering and a thank offering. They also adorned the face of the temple with crowns of gold and small shields, and restored the gates and the priest's quarters, and installed doors. There was great gladness among the people, and the disgrace of the Gentiles was removed. Then Judas and his brothers and the congregation of Israel decided that each year at that time the days of the consecration of the altar would be observed with joy and gladness for 8 full days, beginning on the 25th of the month of Chislev. At this same time they also built high walls and strong towers around Mount Zion, lest the Gentiles come and destroy these things, as they had done before. Then he stationed an army there to guard it, and he fortified the town of Beth-zur, so the people would have a fortress that faced Idumea. So he starts this feast that lasts for 8 days. Anybody know what that's called now? Hanukkah. Or the Feast of Lights. This is where it comes from. Because traditionally, and this isn't in the text of 1 Maccabees, but according to rabbinic tradition, when they first came to light the lampstand, right, the 7 lamps of the lampstand, they couldn't find any sacred oil. Remember, they had to use pure olive oil. Of course, everything had been desecrated. They found 1 bottle of oil that was still sealed. Right? Since it was still sealed, they decided it was still okay to use. But that was only enough oil to last 1 day. Okay, so they went and used it anyway, and miraculously it lasted for 8 days until they were able to get more pure olive oil that they could use. And hence the 8-day celebration. But this is where Hanukkah comes from. And the great irony of this, of course, is that the book of 1 Maccabees is not in the Jewish Bible. It's not. It's not in the Hebrew Bible. It's not in the Hebrew Bible, and yet Hanukkah has become, now mainly that's because of the influence of competing with Christmas. Before it was not a major holiday in Jewish life, but it has now become this major holiday, the origins of which are not in their Bible. So, kind of an odd thing. But we do know there is a mention in the Gospel of John of Christ going to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Lights. So we know that Jesus celebrated at least one Hanukkah from that. So we're going to go ahead and leave off here for tonight. I think this is a good spot. Unless anybody has any questions. Okay, well then, thanks everybody for coming.